Hey, everybody. Thanks very much for coming today. My name's Keith Wiley. I'm with the West Kootenay Transit Action. We're a local group dedicated to boosting public transit services and intercity bus services. It's an affordability and a climate emission reduction plan, and it's about fairness for people, especially people in rural BC. West Kootenay Transit Action.ca. We've muted everybody to start out, so I'd ask you to stay mute until you get your chance to speak, and then we don't have pandemonium. We've been working with the West Kootenay Climate Hub to do great noon hour webinars every month, Friday noon hour webinars. The West Kootenay Climate Hub brings together local organizations and people to accelerate climate action in our region. It's a volunteer-driven. The hub facilitates connections and collaborations, including our monthly webinars. And the next Climate Hub webinar is coming up on Friday, March 15th at noon. It's got local activist and teacher Jan Inglis is going to be exploring the concept of bioregionalism in our community and discussing how we can deepen ecological connections. You can register for them all at the West Kootenay Climate Hub website, westkootenayklimatehub.ca. Go to the events, the webinars are there. There's usually one every month, sometimes more. This month there's more. We must always keep in mind that we are settlers in a colonial state. We are an unceded First Nation land. The rights and title to this land legally belong in the Kootenays, still belong to the original inhabitants, the Sinixt, the Syilx, the Ktunaxa, and the Secwepemc. It's a simple outline today. We're going to start off with a presentation from BC Economist Marc Lee on his new report, Expanding Transit, called Connecting BC. Then we've asked Nelson City Councillor Rik Logtenberg to respond and may ask Mark some initial questions. And then we'll get to some questions and some brief comments from all of us. I'd ask everybody, as you think of a question, you can put it in the chat and we'll get up as many as we can. We're going to do that at the end there. We're going to wrap this all up by once. We just have an hour. I want to introduce Marc right away. Marc Lee is a senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He joined the CCPA back in 1998. I think that was right at the beginning of the CCPA in BC. And he's one of Canada's leading progressive commentators on economic and social policy issues. Marc led the CCPA's Climate Justice Project, which published a wide range of research on fair and effective approaches to climate action through integrating principles of social justice. Marc continues to write about climate and energy policy, strategies for affordable housing, federal and provincial budgets, and economic trends. He's a classically trained economist with an MA from Simon Fraser and a BA in economics from the University of Western Ontario. I wanted to mention that the CCPA had support and collaboration on this project from the BC Federation of Labour. I must say, I've been reading and learning a lot from Marc Lee's reports on policynote.ca. That's the CCPA BC's website, policynote.ca. I've been reading them for years, and I'm delighted to welcome here today to join us. Go ahead, Marc, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm just going to share. Okay, thank you, everyone. So I'm Marc Lee, and with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, I'm calling in from Metro Vancouver, or Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh unceded territory. It's a real pleasure to be with you today to talk about this report we've done. We're very excited about it and the partnership with the BC Federation of Labour. I do want to say that I love the Kootenays. Like, I am a huge fan. I used to go there all the time because my mother-in-law and her husband lived in Castlegar and Nelson for many years and just passed away, both of them a few years ago. In fact, my mother-in-law passed away on the highway between Nelson and Castlegar, which also maybe speaks to some issues around safety and transportation and transit as well. And my father-in-law had a place in Argenta for a really long time and also sold it a few years ago. So I've been to the Kootenays a lot. I love the area. It's really a phenomenal part of BC, and you guys are all lucky to live there. Having said that, I just want to say up front, when it comes to the really local issues around local transportation and local transit services and where services are at and how they would be expanded, don't listen to me. I'm here as an economist, looking at the big picture on transit in BC. And what we developed in partnership with the BC Fed is a high-level vision and investment plan for boosting public transit around the province. But any exact routes or technologies deployed would all be determined, much more at a local level. And in fact, I think there already is a lot of planning work that goes into transit at the local level. So what we're trying to do with our report is not to reinvent any of that work that's been done in partnership with BC Transit and local governments, a lot of citizen participation, but to make sure that those plans get supported and funded. So just last fall, there was this BC Southern Interior Regional Ground Transportation Study, which was a really useful analysis of not just the Kootenays, but also the Thompson Okanagan, but those broader connections and how those could be vastly improved. And then, of course, across the province for going back really to 2008 and the last provincial transit plan, there have been a series of transit future plans or transit future action plans done in partnership with local governments and BC Transit. So the most recent one of those is from 2021. And if you're on this call, you're probably familiar with all of these things already and don't need it to tell you about them. But I think the key for all of this stuff is just to build on the great work that we already have in BC, that BC Transit already is exemplary as an agency in the Canadian context. So there's a lot of things that we can build on. All right, so what are we looking at? One of the things that was really interesting to me came up, was I was starting to do research for the report. There was this BBC show called Race Across the World, and it was a bit rigged. They weren't allowed to use cell phones, and they only had a certain amount of cash that they could use. They had to basically get from Stanley Park in Vancouver up to Tallel in Haida Gwaii. And for the most part, they got a couple hours maybe outside of Metro Vancouver, and then that was it. Like a bunch of them had to, again, because the thing was rigged in terms of what they could do, they had to go and work and make some extra money, or they had to hitch rides with folks or pay people to give them rides in private automobiles. They all eventually got to Tallel, but not because of public transit. So the idea of being able to go from almost anywhere in British Columbia to almost anywhere else, I don't think it's that big a vision to have. If you go to Europe, if you go to Japan, other Asian countries would never even think about renting a car when you got there at the airport. You would just get on the transit system and pretty much everything would flow from that. So I think we could have something like that in BC, building on what we already have, but it's going to need some capital investment and it's going to need some ongoing operating support. So that's basically what the genesis of this project was, and kind of interfacing with some work the BC Fed is doing on a kind of multi-pronged climate and jobs campaign. So all of this is kind of research in service of that kind of campaign, which is bringing in a lot of labor and other NGOs and community groups towards advancing the idea of a transit plan with, a provincial election coming up this fall, and the need to meet, greenhouse gas targets and a whole bunch of other stuff that's happening. We think transit is kind of a key link that pulls all those things together. So what's that look like? First, we need to ensure that transit is affordable, accessible, and inclusive. we are talking about expanding the system, but, there's fundamentally recognizing that a lot of people simply can't drive, can't afford to drive, prefer not to drive, and transit, fundamentally supports their mobility. We also have a lot of accessibility issues, people with disabilities that need special accessibility on whether it's conventional service on buses or custom services like Handy Dart. Improving their mobility is really central to this, and the type of accessibility provisions you would see on a BC Transit bus, for example, don't really often appear in the various private patchwork of services that we see, filling in some of the gaps around the province. These things are obviously going to get more challenging because our population is aging over time. And for transit, like access to healthcare ends up being a really, really important one in terms of people needing to be able to get to an appointment and then get back home. And that simple thing is missing in a lot of the province, but also access to education opportunities, access to work, access to connecting with family members. These are all, key drivers of transit expansion. To get there, we also need to make transit a high quality experience. It needs to be reliable. And that Southern Interior ground transportation study I showed earlier flagged infrequent and inaccessible services as major hurdles to mobility in the region. I think there's considerable latent demand for transit, meaning that if you build it, they will come. If we actually invest in the services and ensure that people can count on them to get where they need to get, and that it's not a massive penalty to a similar trip in a car, then I think people will take those services. And again, that same Southern Interior Transportation study noted the considerable potential for improving the regional connections and to airports as well. Transit infrastructure is also important because we are changing in BC. The way our settlement patterns are evolving. The provincial government has new housing supply targets, and we're adding more density around transit hubs and even in detached housing areas across the city. Those transit investments are fundamental to shaping the development patterns that emerge in the aftermath. And I think they have tremendous potential to really revitalize town centers or some of the areas that are more like suburban in orientation, transforming them into more what urban planners call complete communities, where you can more easily walk or bike or take transit to the services that you need, the places you need to shop, work, all of those things that are really important. And the BC government can also play a complementary role in all of that through strategic investments, seniors residential accommodations that would allow seniors to age in place, other public investments of all different types in terms of infrastructure can really help consolidate. Greenhouse gas emissions. BC's been on this road for quite a while in terms of climate policy. So far, the emphasis is more around a steady, slower transition to low or zero emission vehicles. We've seen some efforts provincially and federally to convert bus fleets to low or zero emission, but we haven't really seen public transit as a central strategy to reduce those emissions in general. So even if we were just to stick with our fossil fuel powered buses and expand those, you would still have a beneficial impact on greenhouse gas emissions because you're sharing rides. So obviously we want both, but that fundamental idea of making transit a driver of greenhouse gas reductions, it needs to be built up some more. And we need to do that because those are the targets that the BC government has set for itself. Right now, we're good at setting targets in British Columbia. We're not very good at meeting those targets. And we've set some pretty ambitious targets around transportation emissions overall and towards that, reducing the number of kilometers traveled and increasing the share of trips in other modes. So public transit is clearly got to be a big part of that strategy. And a co-benefit of that is that to the extent that we do this, we can make ourselves more resilient to oil price shocks like we saw over the last couple of years. And I'm not sure if things are as bad in the Kootenays, but we get a lot of gouging behavior from the oil and gas industry over here in Metro Vancouver. Privatization is also a big issue in the transit system overall, and to some extent in those areas that are not even really covered by BC Transit in this post-Greyhound world. There's a patchwork of services that are, fairly inconsistent, not interconnected very well together. Even within the public system, there's, for the most of the province, that those services are contracted out to various private operators. This isn't good for workers in terms of pay and benefits, and we're essentially paying profits to multinational corporations in order to provide services that we could do ourselves. And if we're thinking about a much more coherent system province-wide, it's really hard to do that when you're dealing with private contractors across the whole province in different situations. And even, on the straight up labor terms, we've seen challenges over the last few years. Several prominent transit strikes have highlighted those issues. So we think a more coherent public system allows us to have these efficiencies, economies of scale, and also deals with some of our challenges around attracting and retaining workers in the sector. So bring this back within the public sector. And this will be a better way of allowing us to have a much more coordinated province-wide system. As was pointed out at the very start of this presentation, there are incredible historical injustices. In British Columbia, I always like to quip that British Columbia is the most colonial name of any jurisdiction on the planet. Indeed true. A lot of the corridors for rail and other transportation were really a violation of rights and title of First Nations. So in the current context, health and safety, significant issues, particularly for rural and remote communities. So all of the developments that we're talking about have to be consistent with free, prior, and informed consent and involved First Nations and Indigenous people actively in the decision-making process themselves. All of this is going to require the BC government to step up as in a leadership role. In what we're talking about, we're dealing with private railways, local, regional governments, First Nations. All of these things mean that the BC government needs to be there to bottom line this financially and also regulatory and legally, and how we even deal with things like BC Transit operating in outside of sort of local areas on a province-wide basis to think about inter-community transit. These things need to be addressed at the provincial level. And on the financial side, it's been long recognized across the province where BC Transit operates that the lack of dedicated multi-year funding commitments is a real barrier to expanding services. All right, so all that preamble, those are important principles that underpin what we want out of our transit system. What does that transit investment plan look like over 10 years? First of all, connecting BC communities with an express bus service. Province-wide network connecting all of the places in British Columbia, obviously not mountaintop to mountaintop, but most of BC is in river valleys and is connectable together. You can actually have very good coverage of most of the province running along those major routes. I think in addition to just the local needs, this has also been recommended in the southern interior and in the north of BC as a means of spurring tourism. At a local level, we want to double the number of buses in the BC Transit network within 5 years and then triple it within 10. this gets to our objective of providing more frequent, reliable transit services where people don't have that long necessarily to wait for their next ride, and they can plan around it and make the trips that they need to make. There's also a lot of really interesting opportunities in terms of how you integrate those more traditional transit services with newer things like ride hailing and car sharing. So on the Sunshine Coast, there's a couple really good examples. Coastal Rides is it's their Uber, basically their car sharing network, and the Coast Car Co-op is a car sharing co-op that provides access to vehicles and trucks and other larger things. Metro Vancouver is experimenting with a new integrated RideLink app that it will integrate transit with bike sharing, car sharing, ride hailing, all of those things. And also we're seeing some interesting innovations in the United States on those kind of first mile, last mile challenges, to supplement the core transit services. There's a lot of goodies in the plan for the South Coast and Vancouver Island, including Metro Vancouver, given that 80% of the province lives here. But, I won't dwell on those. But when you come visit, I think you'd probably really appreciate being able to take a passenger ferry from Vancouver over to Vancouver Island or one of the Gulf Islands, or, some of the commuter rail options that link back some of the province together, including the old BC rail line. From Vancouver through Squamish, Whistler, and all the way up to Prince George. That's part of our plan. In addition to this, we need to expand handy-dart services province-wide and upgrade those to electric fleets. Getting the private contracting is particularly important in that. And we see some scope for expanding the realm of free transit. That is that we should, after the last few years, we expanded free transit province-wide up to age 12. We think that should be expanded to from the age 13 to 18 and basically get young people in the habit of using transit. And if they do that with reliable, upgraded services, they'll be transit users for life. In addition, adding people who are on social assistance to the realm of free transit. And I think overall, as a broader issue, we should be talking about how we can think about free transit much more. But there are costs to doing that. So it's an important conversation to continue with. And then at the end of the day, integrating all of these pieces into a seamless, coordinated whole. Right now, if you're in Chilliwack and you wanted to get to the Sunshine Coast, you'd have to go from one transit system to the TransLink in Metro Vancouver, and then you'd pop onto BC Ferries, and then you take another version of BC Transit on the Sunshine Coast. 4 tickets. We should be able to do this with one ticket and synchronize coordinated service that makes it really easy for people to do the right thing. Angela at the BC Fed did some fantastic kind of transit map-like drawings of what these connections might look like. This is really just based off of that Southern Interior Transportation Plan, slightly stylized version of what they were proposing already. And it just gives you a bit of a sense of what's possible. On Vancouver Island, one of the projects that is of great interest is the Vancouver Island Rail Corridor and repurposing that old corridor and allowing much greater mobility through Vancouver Island. So all of these things are sort of like interconnected, but I think it's that core vision of how we knit this province together through a public transit network. There's a bunch of numbers and costing that I did as part of that. And leave that for you guys to look at in the report. Happy to discuss any of that in the discussion period. But just to kind of put the spending in context, we're calling for a combined capital investment of $22.2 billion. A bunch of that has already ostensibly been promised by the BC government towards some of the work that TransLink is doing. So it's about $15.5 billion of new money, which of course is a lot of money to you and me. But you have to remember that BC's economy is about $400 billion per year, and we already spend substantially on transportation. So in the current three-year fiscal plan that was just tabled last week. $13.5 billion on transportation capital expenditures over the next 3 years, of which, you know, I would argue that that share that's going to transit should be increased, you know, from 4.1 to something much larger. And even that 4.1 billion is most of that's going here in Metro Vancouver, very little outside. British Columbia's already spent $10 billion on new vehicles in 2022. And if you can get rid of a vehicle, you can save a lot of money, but $6,000 to $10,000 per year. So all of these things, I think, make the case that we're already spending the money on transportation. So it's just about how we shuffle that around, and we can do things in a way that's, you know, more efficient, that reinforces better development patterns, that creates good jobs. All of these can be done with some repurposing. And in addition to the capital expenditures, operating support for transit is becoming increasingly an issue across Canada. We're recommending that the subsidy that goes to transit, in this case, that 300 million is combined subsidy to BC Ferries and BC Transit, but that should be raised to about $1.5 billion per year by year 10 of our plan to support the expansion that we're talking about. And that would also allow us to do some of the free transit things we were talking about before. We look at jobs as well. This is a plan that's going to create a lot of jobs, and I think these are exactly the type of jobs that we should be developing. And again, we can talk more about those details after. That's it for me. Thank you so much for listening. Like I said, I love the Kootenay so much, and I can't wait to get back there. In the meantime, please consider checking out our campaign and joining. And Trish Garner from the BC Fed is also here, and they can take maybe any questions on how they can get more engaged later on. If you have any questions on the wonky numbers and details and stuff, send me an email. Happy to chat.
Thanks very much, Mark. Thanks for bringing out that report this year. And I'm so glad to see it at the scale and size that really would make a difference. So people, if you've got questions for Mark, please, as I said, put them in the chat, and we'll get to them just in a bit. But first, I want to invite Nelson City Councillor Rik Logtenberg to respond, because Rik's been a champion for public transit in our area for some time, and he chairs the local West Kootenay Transit Committee, which brings together regional and municipal governments on transit. It's great to have you here today, Rik, to talk about this too. So we have 10 minutes for you to maybe ask questions of Mark, or can you respond, Rik?
Okay, thanks, Keith, and thanks, Mark, for that presentation. And you know, looking at all the people on this call today, I'm really conscious of trying to maybe get through pretty quick so that we can get to questions from everybody else. And I'm not sure how much context is needed. So I'll try to be quick, and then maybe in the questions, if people don't feel like they have enough local context, they can ask those questions. So as Keith said, I'm the chair of the West Kootenay Transit Committee. And in the West Kootenays, we have this integrated transit system that's a combination of both urban or city transit, as we have in Nelson, somewhat in Castlegar and in Trail, and then a rural transit system that connects those communities. We, as multiple local governments, including the City of Nelson, the RDCK, the Regional District of Central Kootenay, and the Regional District of Kootenay Boundary, as well as the City of Trail and Castlegar, together come with BC Transit to sort of form or create the transit plan, and then to coordinate operations as much as we needed. Now, there's a governance level here. That's the City of Nelson and those other local governments that come together at that table. Then there's an operating level as well. And those operations are run, sort of overseen by BC Transit. So BC Transit really does play a kind of an overarching coordinating role for the service. But then you have these operators that actually run the day-to-day operations. And so it's really important, I think, to understand that sometimes when we are experiencing day-to-day challenges with the system, it's either at a policy level, in that perhaps we don't have enough routes, we don't have enough buses, we're not spending enough on transit, or it's an operating challenge given some of the challenges of finding bus drivers on any given day if some are sick, or how the contracts have been negotiated with the drivers. So actually recruiting bus drivers might be a problem too. So recently, there's been an update to the operations of our service. So the City of Nelson, in the process of taking over the West Kootenay part of the system, so everything from New Denver, Silverton, Slocan, all the way to Nelson, Nakusp actually, all the way to Nelson, and then upward to Caslow and North Caslow. So that part of the system is now being run or will be run in the next few months, likely by the City of Nelson, replacing the private operator. So Mark, as you were saying, getting maybe some of the private operators out of the service, well, that's happening at least here somewhat. However, the rest of our system is being run by a private operator, again, replacing NextGen with a larger operator out of Alberta. So lots happening. Now, I think the last bit of context that I want to give you about our local system is that the planning for it, sort of the analysis and then the planning on how to make the system better, is done in conjunction with BC Transit and is produced or shared with the public through the West Kootenay Transit Future Services Plan. Now that plan is available at the BC Transit website. Anybody can look at it, and that will tell you the state of our transit system here in the West Kootenays and where we've identified things that we need to do to fix that system. So, we can get into details on specific routes and stuff like that, and I'm really happy to do that. But we're constantly looking at our system and finding ways to make it better. Now, I'll give you my overall view of the system and what we need to make it better. And it really comes down to money. We need more money to invest in routes, like new routes, so new connections between, for example, the City of Nelson, Salmo, and Trail. And we need more trips. So some trips like the 99 coming from Castlegar to Nelson, the number 10 from Balfour to Nelson are at a critical state where the buses coming down the highway on certain times are over capacity. People are standing in the aisles while they try to get between cities, or they're not even able to get on the bus. So we need a combination of more trips as well as more routes. Both of those things are going to cost money. And so the City of Nelson has spearheaded advocacy to the province for a better funding model with the province. Right now, the way funding happens in transit, half of the money is provided by the province and the feds, and half of the money is provided by local governments and fares. So if we're talking about, for example, free transit, the burden of that free transit is going to come on local governments. And that's either going to require tax increases, because that's directly through property taxes, or some other mechanism. Now, what we've argued at the city and the UBCM, and UBCM has picked up this as something that needs to change, which is that balance needs to fall more on the province. We cannot keep either passing costs on to the riders themselves, many of them who can't afford those costs, or on the local governments in the form of property taxes. So we need more money, and we need a better funding model with the province. So I just wanted to add those bits of context and what we're, as local governments are doing. We're actively advocating for a massive improvement in the system. But to do that, it directly comes down to funding from the province and the feds. So Keith, I just wanted to share that. And then if we go to questions, I'm sure we'll get into a lot of specifics or big policy moves that we can take.
Great local context, Rik. Thanks very much for that. I want Mark. I'd like to ask you directly, right off the top. We had a provincial budget last week, and I saw that it actually contributed hundreds of millions of dollars more to in the transit vein. But some people are saying it's not really enough to make a huge difference. What's your take on the announcement in the budget?
To be honest, I didn't see a whole lot in the budget that was really new. Like I said, the capital plan is like about $13.5 billion over 3 years, of which just over 4 billion is allocated for transit. But that transit money is mostly like SkyTrain in Metro Vancouver. So there's the amount that's left over for everybody else is extremely small. There is money that's been flowing through the federal government in partnership with the province around electrifying buses around the province, but I think mostly it's been around replacement as opposed to adding new buses to the fleet. So yeah, that capital side just really needs to really be built out. The good news is there's a provincial election coming in the fall, and political parties will be campaigning for your vote. And so this is a really good opportunity to, let's push our politicians to be visionary about mobility and take transit really seriously as core infrastructure for mobility across the province.
How would you suggest we do that? What's a good mechanism for us to do that? Mark, I've had some ideas. I've thought maybe we should line one of the highways with signs saying, I need a ride to the Trail Hospital. There's no bus.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed that Trish Garner from the BC Federation of Labor is on this call, and I wondered if they might be able to speak to the campaign and how people can plug into that, because it's really interfacing with all of the major unions that are involved in transportation, but also just the labor movement in general is very supportive of public transit, but bringing into a lot of kind of grassroots community and nonprofit work in the transit space as well. Trish, are you there?
Trish, we'd be delighted to unmute you and hear from you.
No, maybe not. Maybe left the call already. Um,
Maybe I have an additional question. Some
but
people are
check out the
wanting
link I
to.
put in the chat, which has the link to the campaign itself. Because CCPA, I'm like the research nerd, so I'm doing kind of the economics and the number crunching and all that. I'm not good on the campaign side of things, so that's why I want to leave that commentary to the BC Fed. But yeah, I think there are going to be more and more ways of plugging into that and making our collective voice known.
One of the questions that came up in the chat from Tom Schneider is the question of free fares for seniors, and he asked to be fair about it. He asked what portion of the bill is currently paid by fares. And Rik, I know you can address some of that.
Yeah, so we're about half of the local government's portion of it. So 25% effectively is fares. In for context, in the city of Nelson, that's equivalent to about $250,000 that we collect a year in fares. Arguably, if we make fares free for seniors, we're already offering free fares for kids under 12, which then kind of pushes upward actually, because nobody's checking IDs. And so I think it's that now really on our system anyways, probably more like 14, 15. You start to run out of actual fares, and the cost to provide that service doesn't equal the benefit that we're getting from it. So it's arguably at some point it's better just to go full free fare. And I think what's interesting about that idea, and I'm not sort of advocating for it as a counselor or as the chair of the West Kootenay Transit Committee right here. I'm just going to make the case for free on the West Kootenay Transit Committee, is that we are starting to approach that place where the cost to manage it is greater than the fares we're collecting. And as we look to improve and upgrade the system, we do really need more riders on the buses, which then would equate to more investment from the BC Transit side overall into the system. So the case on the West Kootenay Transit system for full free, starts to look more compelling, I think, at some point as you push into other ages trying to offer free to other ages.
And Mark, do you have anything to say about that? Where's the federal government, the people with the big money on all this?
Good question. The federal government has done with the Trudeau government have put a bunch of money towards infrastructure for public transit. There's a new public transit transfer that is being it's one of those things where they announced it a few years ago and it doesn't kick in until like 2026, one of those kind of announcements, but that is ostensibly on the books that will help provide some more core funding across Canada. But yeah, I think we do need operating funding as well as capital, and that's why we made the recommendation in our report that operating funding be increased as a kind of a straight up subsidy to all transit in the province to $1.5 billion. I agree with Rik's comments around free transit. I mean, at heart, I would love transit to be free, or you can sort of say that maybe for like a trip from Vancouver all the way to Fort St. John, maybe you'd have to pay for something, but for local transit and just people getting around, yeah, why not? If you really want to move the needle on climate change and get people taking it, I think free will do that. And we do spend a lot of money. And here in the bigger like TransLink Metro Vancouver thing with fare gates and all of that system stuff, we spend hundreds of millions of dollars in installing and enforcing that system. So at some point you're like, why don't we just use that money for the services that we need?
Yeah.
Good point. I have another question here from Claire Kelly, who asks, and this is a really good question, how does the BC government deal with heavily transit-dependent institutions like post-secondary hospitals and health particularly? And I know our Interior Health is contributing money to transit budgets now. They're taking money out of the health budget because that transit is inadequate. Well, how does the government engage these institutions and BC Transit engage these institutions to determine need and so on? It's a good question.
Well, very good question. And I think it seems like anywhere where there are post-secondary institutions that those students end up being a major users of transit services. So making those connections more robust, more reliable, all of that is definitely going to help. Here in Metro Vancouver, they have a UPass model so that as part of their fees and tuition, all students pay in, and then all students essentially get access to bus passes, whether they use them or not. So it's one way of like spreading out the cost in a different way, so that essentially the marginal cost of each that they use is zero because it's all prepaid at the start of the year. So, those are, I think, that are not free models, but are models that could be, they're sort of quasi-free for, once you have your student card. And I just wanted to flag that Trish Garner has come back on the call, and I wanted to maybe pass the mic to them to talk about the campaign that the BC Fed is organizing and how folks here could plug into that.
That'd be great. Trish?
Okay.
Yes, surely.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Keith, and everyone who's put time into organizing the webinar, and everyone who's here listening. Thanks, Rik, for your comments too. Sorry, I was off for a couple of minutes, lost internet connection, but happy to hear all the questions. So it was great working with Mark and the CCPA on the report. As he said, it was a partnership with the BC Federation of Labour. And as he said, it's part of our bigger initiative, which is to develop a climate justice and jobs plan for BC, which will incorporate many elements. And this is the first pillar to really invest in a really strong, effective, comprehensive, exciting public transit system for the province to really connect us all together, whether we're trying to get places for school, for healthcare, as Mark said, huge issue, for work, for family, for holidays, whatever it might be. So I just did pop the link into the chat there, workersdeservebetter.ca/transit. You can go there and you can check out all the elements of the plan. You can sign up there either as an individual or an organization. And we'd love to see your support. There's a lot in the plan, and Mark outlined a lot of it. But our 3 priorities this year for the election year are: number 1, this intercommunity express bus service. In support of an existing campaign called Let's Ride. This is a big one. Connecting the province. It's a very large province, but we all want to be connected. So investing in that. Number 2, eliminate privatization. That's been a huge issue. As Mark said, many strikes. Many companies here who are putting profit above passenger service and above workers' interests. So eliminate privatization. And of course, many of our members, QP, ATU, etc., have been on the strike lines. And then number 3, Transit for Teens. This is a campaign coming out of the Centre for Family Equity that we're amplifying. They were part of winning the expansion of free transit up to age 12, which has been great for my 11-year-olds. And it would be great to see that expand up to 18 and really build that transit, those transit habits, right? And my teens would love that too. So those are the 3 priorities this year, and I'd love you to join us in supporting those and pushing those for the provincial election. Pass it back to you, Keith.
I'm sure we can. I've got one more question I want to get to here, and then I want to talk a little bit about what we think we can do to raise the issue in the provincial campaign. Sean asks, he'd really like to see the funding increase recommended by the report, but he said it leads to an overall reduction in transportation costs for people, in particular for those of low and middle incomes who spend an increasingly large chunk of their income on private transportation. And the BC government Ministry of Transport, Solita Work asks, its budget is $9 billion. So it's not like what we're spending very heavily on transportation now, aren't we, Mark?
Yeah, exactly. And again, we have to look at the amount that we're already spending on transportation all in, both capital costs and operating costs, but also just private out-of-pocket costs that everyone pays to get around. And the overall BC economy, which is pretty big. It's over $400 billion. So what we are talking about in our plan is a fairly small contribution every year, but it's one that we think would have a really important strategic leveraging impact in terms of the benefits of people being better able to access work and jobs and healthcare. And get people out of cars. And again, I love that idea of like you should be able to get almost anywhere in BC to almost anywhere else with only maybe a modest penalty relative to going in a car. And if you had things like dedicated lanes and infrastructure, if you made it convenient for people and comfortable and reliable, people will take it like they do in Europe. And it's not like we have to reinvent the wheel here. We just need to invest in the infrastructure and the services to make it happen.
Yes, we've been pointing out that it has to be an integrated system, as you suggest in your report, because if you can get a local bus but can't get a bus to Vancouver, then you need to have a car to visit grandma. But if you can get a bus from Vancouver to Nelson, but you can't get anywhere in Nelson or anywhere around there without a car. You need a car on the end. So it needs to be an integrated thing.
Keith, can I just say something? I know we're running short on time, but I want to add something that we haven't
Sure.
brought up yet that I think is pretty important. And that is one of the critical things that's affecting our transit system is the lack of drivers. And I think we have to keep in mind that this is a really complex problem that money alone is not going to solve. We've got the fact that we can't recruit, even though the salaries for drivers have been going up, and it's now pretty significant. And we've got in the case of the city of Nelson, like full union contracts, really well-paying jobs. There's still a recruitment challenge, which is kind of echoed across the workforce. We do have a general workforce shortage for certain or many jobs. So got to put that in because we have to consider and maybe collectively reimagine or reconsider being a bus driver as a really important job. That's the first thing. The second thing I wanted to say is that we do have the BC Transit or the provincial budget has increased funding to BC Transit to the tune of something like $26 million a year. That's excellent. And I think they're committed to doing more. We have to also understand, again, is that it's more than just about money. Transit will require experimentation and a different mindset in how we do and spend that money. So a pilot project on a new route over 3 years is probably the minimum to know if that new route is going to deliver the overall transportation impacts that we're looking for. Sometimes we do these sort of short pilot projects that don't have enough time to for people to get on board with it, no pun intended. So a lot has to be done beyond money. Money's absolutely critical, but we also have to think differently.
There was a good question in chat about changing the culture of our transportation culture around and how, what did he say? Don Gayton called it loser cruisers. Listen, I want to get to a little bit of what all of us can do to bring this issue up in the election. We have a little bit of an idea. And Galen, if you could post it in the chat, the email addresses and the draft note, that would be great, because then people can just copy it right out of the chat or save the whole chat if you like. That's the quick way to keep it all, because we're just about to wind up here. But our one action our West Kootenay Transit Action Group is going to take this year is getting people talking about it in the election. And so we want you to email the leaders of the 4 principal political parties in BC. And we're posting, Galen, if he's got them, the email addresses, a couple of them for each of the leaders, and email them. And there's a draft letter there that says, we need more transit. What are you going to do about transit? Let's talk about transit. And we need to put the pressure on. And we've actually seen a little bit of that pressure work a little bit in the NDP cabinet a bit earlier. That's how we got the ETSI, but we got a report. We didn't get funding. The pressure is going to have to be a lot bigger. So if you could post that up, Galen, and I just encourage people to grab those email addresses, email the political leaders, say, this election, I'm very curious to see what your platform is going to be on increasing transit and a BC-wide coach service that takes us all across the province so people can visit friends and relatives and get the health services. And we're going to be doing more about it too. This has been a great webinar. Mark, I want to thank you for the report. It's a great tool to use this year. Trish, I want to thank the Federation of Labor for getting on board with this and the campaign you've got going. And Rik, thanks for joining us today and giving us the local perspective. It's been so good. I think we're going to have to wrap it there today because we've run out of time, but grab the information in the report, grab those email addresses, do it today, send out, after I get off this call, I'm going to send out those emails and tell them I want to see this election talking about transit and more buses and a province-wide bus system. So nice to see Nicole Charlwood on the call too today, and so many other people. So I think if that's enough, unless there's anything else urgent, I'm going to say it's time to wind it up. Yeah, everybody wave bye. Thanks for coming, everybody. It's been a great webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch. There'll be a recording coming out, so I'll be in touch with it.